On the 10th of March, Highgate Choral Society will perform Handel's oratorio Israel in Egypt, one of the great choral masterpieces in the repertory. Handel invented the English oratorio, and of course Messiah is the most famous of them, and the influence of the oratorio on choral music has been profound. Haydn came to this country and went back to write his creation, and then during the Victorian era, many composers, Mendelssohn, Elijah, wrote oratorios for this country, and there were many British oratorios too. And that tradition goes right through to almost the present day. Tippett's Child of Our Time, for example, and perhaps even Paul McCartney's Liverpool oratorio. The word oratorio had been around for 100 years when Handel first wrote his, and refers to the oratory of St. Philip Neri in Rome, and works were written there in the 1600s, setting texts from the Bible or setting stories from the Bible. The most famous of those is by Carissimi and is Jephthah, setting of the story of Jephthah from the book of Judges. And in fact, Handel's last oratorio is also a setting of that story of Jephthah. And Carissimi's work is a series of arias and choruses which tell the story. He actually wrote in Latin and called it an oratorio, and Jephthah is considered the masterpiece of those oratorios. And then Handel picks up the trail, as it were, in the 1730s. Handel was born in Saxony in 1685, and as a young man in the early 1700s, travelled to Italy to find out what Italian music was like, and while there wrote Italian pieces including Dixit Dominus and these various cantatas for solo voice, mainly for soprano, in the Italian style. And then he goes back to the Elector of Hanover, where he was employed, and then makes a visit to London, and then a second visit to London, where in fact he stays and eventually becomes a British citizen, in fact. And in London he brings with him his Italian opera Rinaldo in 1710, which is a huge success. And so his career in London, first of all being employed by one or two noblemen, including the Duke of Chandos in canons, for which he writes the various Chandos anthems, but then he becomes an impresario writing Italian operas for London. And they were hugely successful because Handel was bringing over the divas, the sopranos and the castrati from Italy, and they were like the pop stars of their day, and in fact the more scandals there were about them, the more popular the operas were. But by the 1730s there was now a rival opera company, the Opera of the Nobility, with royal backing, and revenue was falling a bit. Also over a period of time, I think Londoners were getting rather fed up with opera in Italian, a language they didn't necessarily understand. And in 1741, Deodamia is Handel's last opera, in fact. So in the 1730s, Handel is thinking about other things to do, and the opportunity arises to perform an oratorio. Now, he himself had written a couple of oratorios in Italian in Italy, and while he was at with the Duke of Chandos in canons, had written a setting of the story of Esther. And so in 1732, he revives this story of Esther and presents it in London, or intends to present it in London, in a theatre. And the Bishop of London says you can't have a sacred piece staged. And in fact, we should define an oratorio as being like an opera, only on a sacred text, but with no staging. And so Handel decides, because he's put together his boys and his men, the sort of people that sang the coronation anthems, and he puts these people together in a theatre and advertises it and says that it's going to be like a dramatic performance but without any staging. And in 1732 that oratorio of Esther was a success. It's occurred to me also to say that the Elector of Hanover becomes George I, and so Handel is here in this country, and George then becomes king of this country, which is why Handel is taken up again by the royal family and then writes the coronation anthems and becomes a very established composer here. After Esther, he writes Deborah, and then Atalaya, which is slightly unusual in being not a sacred text. And then in 1739, he wants to present Saul and Israel in Egypt. Now, Saul is very typical of what an oratorio should be because it is a drama. It's the story of Saul and David and the battles that go on, all the stories from the Old Testament. And it's set out with a libretto with stage directions. And in fact, at one point, Saul throws his spear, and in the score it says that very thing, that Saul throws his spear, and the music represents that and breaks off the rage aria that Saul is singing. But with Israel in Egypt, and again with Messiah, things are slightly different in that the drama is told through verses from the Bible, in the case of Israel in Egypt, from the Old Testament. And we believe that the libretto was put together by Jennings, the same man who put together the libretto of Messiah. And the story is of the plagues which came upon the Egyptians because they were keeping the Israelites captive. And then part two, as we will perform it, is the Song of Miriam, the song of praise that they have escaped. Now, Handel wanted a three-part oratorio, that was the norm, and so he tacked on the front the funeral anthem he'd written for Queen Caroline, The Ways of Zion Do Mourn, and by changing the words to refer to the Israelites, he had created a three-part oratorio. The oratorio wasn't a great success, in fact, and I think there are two reasons for that. One, because of all this biblical text, which is from the Bible and is not quite what the audience were expecting, but also it's very heavily choral. Almost everything in parts 2 and 3 are written for the chorus. Part 2 only has one aria in it, which describes the plague of the frogs. And so what happened over a period of time is that Handel revived it and put in more solos, but he also, or perhaps we, have dropped part 1, which is rather irrelevant to the story, and start now with part 2, the plagues, and go into part 3. And so our performance will begin like that. And our slight problem is part 2 begins with a recitative. There is no introduction. And so I will find an orchestral piece by Handel to go on the front to make an overture to our performance. So part 1 describes the plagues and is very dramatic in that sense and great fun to sing. And then part 2 is also dramatic because it expresses the joy of the people and describes how the sea stood in pillars as the Israelites went through. One unusual aspect of the oratorio is that a lot of the music is based on previous material, some of it by Handel himself. The chorus at the beginning, "They loathed to drink of the river," is based on an organ piece by Handel, and he transcribes that almost exactly. And then a little bit later in part 1, we hear about the plagues. He led them through the deep as through a wilderness. And that is based on a chorus from Dixit Dominus. And in fact, if you look at it, what Handel does is not just write it out again, but actually rewrites it. So if we look at Dixit Dominus, where the chorus is about the priest Melchizedek, the writing is in 5 parts for 5-part choir. But in the oratorio Israel in Egypt, it's now for double chorus. And that's an important thing, actually, that a lot of the choruses are these extravagant double choir numbers. But he also transcribes a couple of organ pieces by other composers, one of them by Johann Caspar Kerl, Egypt Was Glad When They Departed. And that piece is already 100 years old when Handel rewrites it. And I think that's meant to represent the old style, or perhaps meant to represent the Egyptians and their rather strange tonal language. And then he uses a great deal of material from a serenata by Stradella. And one of the choruses where he takes the chords and the harmony from Stradella is the one about the flies and the lice. But of course, again, Handel is rewriting because he's adding the buzzing sound and the violent figuration of those flies and the lice. And then there are 2 other pieces, or 2 obscure composers, Erba and Uriah, who wrote a Magnificat and a Te Deum respectively, and Handel quotes quite a bit of their music throughout the piece. But I don't want us to think that that quoting means that there's anything wrong with what Handel is doing. There's no copyright in these days. You can borrow material, your own or anybody else's, but what Handel is doing always is rewriting and creating something new. And so for us, the piece is a magnificent thing to sing, very exciting, expressing all those plagues. It's scored for quite a large orchestra with trombones, there are flutes in a couple of the movements, and also, of course, the oboes, trumpets and drums. And then, as I say, not many solos, and in part two, they're almost always duets, including a duet for two basses, which is unique in Handel's repertory. So Israel in Egypt is a towering masterpiece. Not a great success then in Handel's day, but in Victorian London it certainly became a huge success in the days when thousands of people would come together to sing because of cheap printing the Novello vocal scores. So you can imagine thousands of people in the Crystal Palace singing along to these gigantic choruses.
Great.
Okay.
Yeah.